Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited to have friend of the podcast back, Richard M. Reinsch the second. I did not really remember the second part, but it's here in front of me. He's the editor-in-chief of the Civitas Institute's Civitas Outlook. He was the founding editor of the really fantastic online magazine Law and Liberty, and he's held positions at the American Institute for Economic Research, Heritage Foundation, Before the Fall, Liberty Fund, etc. Reinsch's books include A Constitution in Full, Recovering the Unwritten Foundation of American Liberty, and Whittaker Chambers, The Spirit of a Counter-Revolutionary. Richard, welcome back to the Remnant.
Hey, thank you for having me.
I apologize. I never read your Whittaker Chambers book, and he's one of the guys, I did this Who Was Leo Strauss episode once, and people liked it. Maybe down the road we should do a Who Was Whittaker Chambers.
Oh, that would be wonderful. No, that was 2010, and it was this ISI had this series of books on sort of foundational conservative thinkers, Wilhelm Röpke, Robert Nisbet, Ludwig von Mises, and others. And so I said, you need one on Whittaker Chambers. But the response was the Sam Tannenhouse book was so good.
It was good.
Why would we? And I said, well, someone who put together the writings that he had were not thick and voluminous, but what you had was really good stuff. And so distilling that would be a service. Yeah.
I have that collection. Was it Notes on the Roof or something? What's it called? Did you ever read? I mean, again, for listeners, you should know we were just chatting like two old ladies around the village well before the thing started about conservative stuff. And so we're still in that mode, and I'll try to professionalize this up in a second. But did you ever read the last piece Sidney Blumenthal wrote for the New Yorker as a staff writer before he joined the Clinton administration?
I did not know.
It was basically loosely review-ish about the Tannenhouse book, but he used it as a broader argument to make the case that basically modern conservatism and anti-communism in particular, these were all just window dressings for the closeted homosexuality of the American right. And I'm exaggerating and distorting a little bit, but not a lot. It's been a while since I read it, but I remember I wrote about it for National Review. I was gobsmacked when I read the thing. It was such bad faith and grotesque. But anyway.
I guess that's a way of saying we're like German fascist generals, many of whom are homosexual or something.
That's right.
Or tying into that energy.
Yeah. In secret at National Review, we all wore leather onesies and danced around or something. I don't know. All right. So you had a great piece for commentary, and this is a good gateway to the conversation. Now that I've gotten my dropping leather onesie out of the way. Very near and dear to my heart in terms of how I see things and the project ahead. You had a great piece called Against Grievance Politics. The case for conservatism is as strong as ever. Why don't we just sort of just run us through it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had the idea for the piece actually listening to the commentary podcast. Several months ago, Matthew Cognetti said something that I had not thought about, which was sort of the learning of many conservatives at the end of the Nixon presidency was that we needed to return to principles. And that, what Nixon had done was not unlike what Trump had done. He ran as a populist, the famous Nixon Hard Hats coalition, defending America, defending law and order, patriotism, linking up with, formerly Democratic voters or currently Democratic voters. And this was sort of in the air. And that kind of resonated with me because I wrote a piece one time about Bill Buckley's brother, the sainted James Buckley, in his first Senate campaign for New York. He kind of did something very similar, and you can go and look at his old TV ads on YouTube, and they make sort of this populist law and order pitch throughout the state of New York. And Nixon runs as a populist and wins, but then governs in all sorts of strange ways, and does not govern in anything like what the conservative movement as it existed then had really talked about in terms of economics, right? He emphasizes wage and price controls, builds the environmental and regulatory state, adds to the regulatory state, takes us off the gold standard, all sorts of things like that. And then you have Watergate, and then you have the Ford presidency coming on the heels of that. And I think conservatism sort of looks at itself and says, well, what are we about now? We're at a nadir. How are we going to rebuild? And then I was also reading Continetti's chapter, the Prairie Fire, from his book, The Right. And you could see the remnants being pulled back together in that sort of low point. And it centers around what we could now call supply side economics, but was then sort of this idea that had emerged. Robert Mundell, Art Laffer, among others, but then also Jude Wanniski, famously Wall Street Journal editorial writer, and meeting with each other and sort of putting these ideas together. Alongside that, there was something in Richard Newhouse at the time, still a Lutheran pastor, and Peter Berger, a sociologist, who go on to found the great journal First Things. And they're saying, well, we have individualism running amok in our culture, but it's also being promoted by welfare state policies as well. We have to think about the family and the neighborhood and religion and sort of the relational person, the thing that Tocqueville talks about in Democracy in America. All these things that are sort of the antidote to the egalitarianism of a democratic age and culture. And then the third thing that came to mind is this great book on Ed Meese, Reagan's Attorney General, who has just been reinserted in a way into conservative debates. And this book about Ed Meese, called The Meese Revolution, is how he put together originalism within conservative legal culture, which at the time sort of lacked an anchoring ballast, and made originalism, put it front and center as the way in which conservative judges and then conservative legal academics and then what became the rising legal subculture in the Federal Society would operate on. And you look at all these things and it says to me, that's a conservatism of self-government, of economic opportunity. And those are foundational principles that set conservatism up for great success in the 80s and 90s. And now we run away from them. And we think they're weak. We think they've done nothing but conserve liberalism. And the other insight that kind of came to me was from your AEI colleague, Nicholas Eberstadt, on the means-tested entitlement culture explosion in this country over the last few decades. And it just sort of coalesced in my mind that really what J.D. Vance and others supporting him are really doing is they aren't restoring an economic self-governing agenda, freedom agenda for American citizens that conservatism has been built on, but they're actually accepting the entitlement means-tested culture and sort of building on that in a way, a future conservatism that will be predicated on telling you really can't be a free and independent citizen. You're actually going to need the government to help you in a lot of ways because you've been victimized. And it seems like this is a core part of Vance's messages. So many people have been victimized by the deep state, by war, by corporations, and he is here to sort of navigate and negotiate for you. And that all sort of came together, and I thought I should try to write about this to remind people what this was all about to begin with, as opposed to the caricatures that we hear so frequently. And quite frankly, from a lot of younger people on the right who don't know the history, don't know the books or the ideas, but are very confident in these pronouncements they make.
Yeah, so I have a bunch of thoughts on this. One, I made a similar point about a month ago. Ross Douthat had that column trying to predict the different ways the American right could go, and basically almost all of them, I mean, he to his credit, Ross is a really smart guy. He was like, we don't know. But like, he didn't really have a lane for anything like a conservative restoration. And there was a lot of straight line projection stuff going on. It was like, well, if Vance gets the mantle, it'll become this. If Rubio gets the mantle, it'll become that. But the assumption was the mantle was something that everyone would want, and that the direction would still be Trumpy, just in some, we just couldn't be sure which facet of Trumpism. And I was like, well, go back and look at Richard Nixon, his administration ended, and we did not get more. I mean, like, Nixon was a hugely consequential figure. He basically wanted a Nixonian New Deal and a Nixonian Great Society, and he did more interventions in the economy than let's just put it this way, anybody remembers. And
Yeah.
and the conservative movement did a 180 on Nixonism. And it's kind of forgotten in part because the left doesn't want to admit how liberal Nixon was, and the right doesn't want to admit how liberal Nixon was. But you raise a different point as well, which I think is, I think about a lot. I just did this thing on the white culture stuff. A huge amount of the, let's call it the MAGA project, because which includes different schools of thought, but it's the new right, right? A lot of what the new right is basically surrender to progressive categories.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's saying we have, as your point about grievance politics, there are people who have been victimized and the government needs to help them. It's just not the people currently being helped. It's our people, right?
Yeah.
The left has this identity politics stuff about how whiteness is evil. We're going to take that exact same form of categorical thinking, but we're going to say whiteness is awesome, right? The left has this idea about industrial policy to fight climate change and wants to hang all these Christmas tree ornaments on it for DEI and whatnot, with our industrial policy. But so we're going to take that idea and we're going to do industrial policy our way, where we reward our people instead of their people. Again and again and again, it's a right-wing version of a kind of progressive politics rather than an alternative to it.
Yeah. No, it also, it sparks to mind too. I mean, if we think about, if we go back again to this period of the 1970s of early neoconservative writers who were saying the right had overly focused on eliminating the welfare state aspect of the New Deal and removing that, and that wasn't possible. That wasn't likely. And what you should actually focus on is building a conservative welfare state and using it for conservative ends. But that kind of proved unworkable. I mean, empirically. I mean, and I think people like Irving Kristol came to understand that after a period of time. However, it seemed like a plausible argument. And my thinking right now is, so if we ask ourselves in the first Trump administration and second Trump administration, what are the policies unique to MAGA? What are the policies that they can claim uniquely as their own that you can't sort of stair step or build on from the original conservative movement they claim to displace? And it seems that we're getting some big ones right now in the stakes in companies. I think from what I've read, 15 companies the government has now taken ownership positions in. And we've also got the tariffs, which have been a moving target the entire time, which seems to prove our argument, I think. But we do have a massive amount of taxes that were imposed on the American people through the tariffs, and which seem to have accomplished absolutely zero of the objectives that we've also heard about reshoring manufacturing jobs, increasing manufacturing production, et cetera. Nothing like that has emerged. We have no evidence of that whatsoever. And in the question that we have, let's take a really harsh immigration posture. Let's go beyond just removing violent illegal immigrants, but we're going to really go in. We're going to have quotas, and we're going to arrest, 3,000 people a day. And we're going to send agents out into people's homes, into Target parking lots, all sorts of this business. And the American people saw it, amplified by these two shootings, of course, but seem to have turned away from it. And it seems to be that the Trump administration finds itself on the back foot on what were its strongest policy pieces are coming out of the election, the economy and immigration, precisely because they followed the MAGA playbook. All of this should I think, raise in people's minds a question. It should start to. What exactly is conservatism about? What is the Republican presidency about? Because the things that are uniquely positive for the Trump administration, I would go back to its supply side economic principles that he's built on, even in the One Big Beautiful Bill, as mixed as that piece of legislation was. It's the conservative judges, and it's also trying to find ways of shoring up a traditional culture that emphasizes family and community and the things that bring people to build people around a conservative ethos. So it all, to my mind, the record still remains very mixed as to what the conservative movement will be. But there's this splash about, Orrin Cass writing against financialization last week in the New York Times. There's this sort of love of the contrarian take that continues to inspire people and inspire people who should know better, quite frankly, in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I find the argument about tariffs to be incredibly frustrating
Mm-hmm.
because you get the Trump defenders, which are in terms of the realm of economics, it's either non-economists and activists like Orrin Cass,
Mm-hmm.
and his outfit, which is getting, part of its business model is to undermine the right's
Yeah,
commitment to free market capitalism, and its funders are getting value for their payments, right?
they are.
But for the most part, among actual economists, the who aren't on who don't have TV shows, let's say, but who are actual real economists, um, the almost all the defenders are people in the administration. It's Kevin Hassett and these people, and they use these talking points where they'll say all of these economists predicted inflation, which is not really true. They predicted higher
Right.
prices and
Yeah.
economic dislocations, but whatever. When Trump announced his tariffs, that hasn't happened. They're all wrong. And as my friend David Bonson and other people have pointed out, well, part of the problem with that argument is Trump has rescinded vast numbers of the tariffs that he announced on Liberation Day. And he hasn't actually followed through at the scale that he originally wanted to. And so you don't really have a great sort of pool of evidence to draw from. But
Mm.
what you do have is that the Trump administration is constantly having to pull back on its tariffs in order to do its affordability stuff. And we've seen no reshoring to speak of, right? That really
No.
matters. We haven't seen any boost to the industrial thing. But my problem with that form of argumentation, which is all over the place, is this: those people said X isn't true, therefore what we're doing is awesome, which is not logically a great
Mm.
argument. Just because somebody is wrong, so just because a critic is allegedly wrong or legitimately wrong, doesn't mean what you're doing is right.
Mhm.
And you find that form of argumentation, it's sort of the pundification of political discourse, insofar as, like, you look at the responses to the white culture stuff, which I want to get to.
Mhm.
Enormous number of people are saying their defense of it is that, well, the left started, which I think to some extent is true, with all their whiteness studies and anti-white stuff and all that kind of stuff. But that was bad. We said it
Yeah.
was bad, right? And
Yeah.
now because they did it, it's okay for us to do it too, is not an argument, but that is sort of the crux of a vast amount of the argumentation out there.
No, and what I've read to this day, 40 to 50% of goods coming into America are free of tariffs.
Mhm.
So, something along those lines. And then if you also look at the exceptions that have been made for technology and other high profile goods that are needed in our economy, it's not a surprise that the tariffs haven't created the economy. Of course, we forget that week after Liberation Day was set, there was a flight from the dollar.
Right.
We also had interest rates going up. I mean, it looked like we were set for not an economic calamity, but for an economic downturn. And then all of a sudden, Peter Navarro left the office, is the story, and in swoops Scott Bessent to save the day and convince Trump to walk some of the stuff back. Which and then you've recently removed tariffs on all sorts of things that we don't even produce in this country. Surprise, surprise. I fear, and the great former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, made this point in the Washington Post. My fear is what the Trump administration has done is set down the precedent for a national consumption tax,
Mhm.
or these tariffs stay in place with the next administration, precisely because they do build revenue, and we are in need of revenue given entitlement commitments that no one seems to want to revisit. Not that the tariff revenue is going to be sufficient for that, but it could be enlarged. Some sort of new tax could be purposed to that end, and we're already kind of used to it. That's one fear that I have. It also seems, you hear that Larry Kudlow or Newt Gingrich, Kevin Hassett, and others will say one thing in public in support of Trump's economic program to preserve the ability to be able to speak to Trump privately and keep him on an economic growth message. I don't know if that's true. I've heard that. That would be the best argument I could see for what these guys say in public. But it does seem Kevin Hassett yesterday threatening research economists at the New York Fed for a study affirming long-held conclusions on tariff policies and how they affect consumers. And he suggests they should be disciplined for that research is a line crossing in the Trump administration on these policies, indicating they know they're losing. And they're losing, it's a part of, you mentioned Ross Douthat earlier. Ross Douthat said Trump has lost the country. This is one way he lost the country. His major economic intervention, one of them is the tariff policy. And people associate that, rightly or wrongly, with these ongoing high prices they pay for everyday consumer goods.
Yeah, Kevin Williamson, very different Kevin, in tone and tenor and life story, had a great piece the other day for us about the unseen costs of the tariff, which was very Bastiat, right? It was, it doesn't necessarily, tariffs don't necessarily mean higher prices for consumers. They mean higher costs. And so some businesses can swallow, they don't pass it on to the consumer. What they do is they don't hire a new employee. They don't give out bonuses at Christmas. They don't do an expansion for a third location for their diner, chain. They don't fix the potholes in their parking lot. You go down a very long list of it's the irrational distortion of economic decision making all along the supply chain. My sister-in-law bought some yarn or crochet thread or something months ago, and this is a big hobby of hers or something, and she just got a bill from, I want to say DHL or something like that, for the tariff on the thread that was about 80% of the price of the thread. That was just like, and my point is, it's like the way I think about this is, imagine they came up with a really stupid reason to give people driving tickets. Tickets like, if you have your elbow out the window, you're going to get a $50 fine. And it's a dumb thing, but it's a revenue raise or whatever. Even if you can afford the $50, the first time that happens to you, you're furious about it for a really long time,
Yeah.
And the country is full of people now who have stories about, either from their own life or their sister-in-law, about how the tariff is messing up their businesses. And it doesn't matter to a certain extent its full effect on the economy. People live in microeconomies, and they think this stuff matters because it matters to them, and they associate it with larger trends.
Well, just anecdotally, I live in Northeast Ohio. Stories from people who are working in the manufacturing industry of how materials they source from Asian countries are now they can't plan their businesses anymore, and one of the ways they've responded is they're not hiring people. So you've put into place anti-growth conditions in the very industry you claim to be helping, and so this is when someone told me that, it was a gentleman that works in a company that makes remote control devices for large manufacturing pieces of equipment, and they source the remote control devices from various countries in Asia. Now they don't know what the prices are going to be necessarily in the future, and so when you do that, you just stop expanding, or you stop innovating because you have no idea what the future is going to hold. That's this is not a way to proceed.
All right, so I keep dropping hints about it.
I look forward to this.
So there's this big argument. A guy named Jeremy Carl was up for a State Department position. Full disclosure, I met him once or twice, in maybe 3 times in my old NR days. And he's written a book, which I've not read, about the anti-white stuff from the left. That's all fine. I don't want to make it about Jeremy Carl, but he had a bad appearance in front of the Senate for his confirmation hearings. Some Democrats were, I think, unsurprisingly aggressive about his views. He's tweeted Jim McCarthy has tweeted some really horrendous things about January 6th and all that kind of stuff. He's a very red-pilled Claremont kind of guy. He's at the Claremont Institute. But it sparked a broader conversation about whether or not, what is white culture, and should it be the term that we use for American culture, American majority culture, American traditional culture, Western European culture, Western civilization. And there are a lot of people who sort of joined the argument. I'm just kind of curious, how do you see it? And if I've left out some important context, let me know. But
yeah, it was funny. I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, right outside of Nashville, and there was a sociologist used to be at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His name was John Shelton Reed, if I'm getting his name correctly, and he wrote about Southern white culture, even after World War II, and so we're now in the realm of the New South and Civil Rights South, and what Walker Percy called the air conditioned South. And he said it had a remarkable coherence to it. And I grew up in this small town, but my grandfather was from German Midwestern farming people, and his my grandmother, he met her in Scotland during World War II, so they were not Southerners. And I kind of grew up in Southern culture and in the New South realm, but also kind of I think able to maybe have some distance from it. And so I understand that white culture, in a sense, if you want to use that term. I mean, it was hunting, fishing, football, a lot of outdoor stuff. But then if you think about it, is that like North Dakota? Is that like
Right.
is that like the German Scandinavian belt in the upper Midwest, et cetera? I mean, there's tons of differences there. I think, just fundamentally, I'll say the idea of using white culture as a way to defend and advance and build principles on as a conservative for things that we believe in seems just fundamentally an error. And fundamentally an error, I would argue, because the principles we are trying to build around is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And those are the principles we want to be constitutive of our culture overall in this country, which there will be incredible diversity of all the different groups and the things that they do and associate with. But fundamentally, we want to have a culture of a certain kind of individualism, a certain kind of devotion to family. We want to be open to religion. We want to support those things. We want to support commerce. We want to have a colorblind constitution, a colorblind institutions within our country. And it seems you would want to build on those principles. I don't even know what you think you get from saying white culture other than a counter tribal ethos to what left progressivism has tried to build on with multiculturalism, and sort of they have taken an anti-white posture in many respects. That's true. But the way to oppose that, and the way I thought we were always doing that as conservatives, and doing it with great success, was to emphasize the dignity of the individual rights inherent in human nature coming from God. And we build on those things, which we're having success doing that. And even if, as I was watching that testimony from Jeremy Carl getting grilled by a fairly loathsome progressive senator from Connecticut named Chris Murphy, who also never has a kind word to say about Israel, even as it's defending itself after October the 7th. I kept thinking to myself, the high point of this sort of racialized progressivism, starting in that horrible summer of 2020, the summer of George Floyd, and then extending itself into the Biden administration, into a lot of liberal governments, our public education system, and all of the ways in which it manifests itself in football that fall. And I just thought they threw everything they had, and it didn't work ultimately. I mean, I think a lot of Americans, and not just conservative Americans, said, kind of threw their hands up and said, we don't want this. This isn't how we want to live. And we don't want this to be the organizing principles of our lives, which seemed to say to me that was the opening. Like that was the way in which we had sort of created this reminder, or helped undergird this reminder of who we are as Americans and what our principles are. And so to come along now with a racialized white culture analysis, which he really couldn't even define. I mean, that was kind of like my opening answer to you. I think about Southern whites that I grew up around, but there is really nothing you can really point to other than sort of generalized things. and why you want that to be the basis of what is also a multiracial conservatism now, strikes me as the wrong way to go.
Yeah, I mean, so the white culture thing drives me crazy in so many different ways because it is a homogenizing concept, right?
Yeah.
It is saying that rural Alabama whites and rural New Hampshire whites, they're just same culture, which is nonsense, right? I mean, it's like the whole point of the conservative kind of approach to why we argued for subsidiarity and federalism and all that kind of stuff is to respect the different folkways of different people. And this is sort of like the turning whiteness into a brand, approach for Cracker Barrel. Like that's whiteness, right? And like next door is Chili's, and that's Hispanicness, and that's just not how it actually works. And it shows me the extent to which, and also just a more practical thing. I get a lot of grief from listeners sometimes when I focus on how things are stupid politics rather than morally judging them, and I'm perfectly fine. I got moral judgments coming out of every pore here. I can do moral judgments. I think the white culture thing is ultimately, even the best intentioned things are inadvertently, I still think it's evil, because what you're doing is you're basically perpetuating the argument that Thomas Sowell was just acting white, right? And which is insane, right? It's like I spent most of my life being offended when people called Clarence Thomas or Thomas Sowell Uncle Toms because they were conservatives. And now basically that's the upshot of the white culture argument, is that anyone who succeeds in white culture, it's because they're acting white, which is it's just an inverted version of the left's argument against meritocracy. Is like you have to sell out and assimilate and give up your culture to be successful in white America with 3Ks. And I think it's all BS. But it's also just really stupid politics. Like, conservatives have struggled for decades with the insinuation that they're racist.
Yeah.
And because a lot of Americans don't want to be racist. And then you say, well, if you join the Republican Party, you're joining the party that is going to make defending white culture its top priority. You you think you're going to attract more people than you're going to lose doing that?
Yeah. No, it was interesting as well. I mean, Jeremy Carl, has this affiliation with the Claremont. I think that's his primary affiliation with the Claremont.
It is
Institute.
now. Ironically, he used to be a fellow at Hoover.
Okay.
Which I would love to know what Thomas Sowell thinks of some of his arguments.
But I was a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute many years ago, taught by Harry Jaffa and in that program, Charles Kessler, amongst others, Stephen Hayward, Ed Erler. And now I'm thinking about that instruction that I received, in particular, from reading Harry Jaffa's two books that we read, House Divided, which is an amazing book, amazing work in American political thought. And his second book, which is sort of reflects the transition that Harry Jaffa went through, and where becomes more situated on the almost the immaculate founding natural rights thesis of America. But I was just thinking about that Claremont Institute that really centered around the Declaration of Independence and centered around natural rights as announced in the second paragraph of the Declaration as the seedbed and the foundation of the American political order, of the American constitutional order. And so those are, you could say they overemphasize those. They turned the American founding into a political theory contest. There are problems if you only talk about individual rights to the exclusion of other goods. I understand those critiques. But my point is that's a Claremont Institute that I think would have really taken issue with a Jeremy Carl white culture thesis. And, another thing that came to my mind, Charles Kessler's a wonderful book, collection of essays that was published, I want to say in 2019, Crisis of the Constitution, or Crisis of the Two Constitutions. He has a wonderful essay in there addressing, I think it was his former teacher at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, in a book that came out, I want to say, 2000, 2001, Who Are We? 2002 maybe. And Huntington is coming to terms with, we've had a massive wave of immigration to America at that time, from late 1980s up through 2009. Was very heavy Mexican immigration, and Huntington's trying to think through what are the distinctive attributes to America that we want to preserve and which could be threatened by this wave of mass immigration. He was widely criticized for writing this book, but he was on to something. And one of the things he talked about was Anglo-Saxon political, economic, constitutional culture being America, our origins and who we are as a people. And Kessler in this essay sort of, says, well, he's definitely on to something. There's a reason why the American political system and economy looks the way it does and doesn't look like Brazil's, doesn't look like Mexico's. But it's this sort of problematic rooting it in culture that Kessler draws issue with and wants to root it back into what's distinctive about the founded nature of our country. That's what he wants to build on. Those are principles that are universal, but are realized by a particular people and time and, imperfectly applied. We're still working them out, of course, but that has to be the basis, because that's the basis of a revolutionary people, the principles themselves that we announce are good and true and we believe in. And I just thinking about that and thinking about Jeremy Carl being asked by Chris Murphy, what is a white culture? And he kind of fumbles through all of these sorts of things. And it's because it's really indefinable. It's more of a reaction to left progressives' own, absurd ideas that we reject.
Yeah, I think as an analogy, it's similar to the arguments you get in feminism, or about feminism, where it's supposed to be rejecting the male patriarchal system, but there's a whole branch of sort of professional meritocracy feminism that says the only way, it's sort of a Denenian point, so I'm not embracing it entirely, but just descriptively, that the only way for women to be equal is to emulate men, right? Whether it's in sports, whether it's in business, like the definition of success in our culture is a 40 to 60 hour work week of success on your way to the C-suite. And that's what women need to be successful. And it's a buying into a categorical way of thinking things and just sort of inverting it for your own team. And that's what this, seems to me a big chunk of the white culture stuff is it's taking a left-wing categorical way of thinking. It's sort of like Nietzschean resentment, right? Where you take the standards of the other side and you just flip them around, but you're still thinking categorically on their terms, or maybe it's René Girard or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The idea that you're going to boil down traditional American culture to whiteness is such a simplification and a counterproductive one for reasons I said. But I'm less hostile to the Huntington argument about culture being important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cultural institutions. I'm very sympathetic to Charles's view of the Constitution. The nation didn't create the Constitution. The Constitution created America kind of thinking. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But we should, I think that, a lot of Latin American countries had basically copied almost word for word our Constitution. And they went kaput because there was something about their cultures that wasn't suited for that kind of Constitution. And so I think it's more of a, you got the chocolate of your Constitution and the peanut butter of my culture kind of dynamic. You need both. It's a both and, not an either or thing. Thomas Hole often makes the point that we used to make the point. It's interesting to know where people come from when you're talking about immigrants and cultural, imports and influences. It's also really important to know when they came, because you could take, Scots who came to America 250 years ago were very much sort of Smithian, individualist, free market, very seriously religious. Scots today are a bunch of, lazy coffee house Reds, cultures change. And And so anyway, my only point is like I think there was merit to the Huntington thesis, but there's also merit to the Kessler thesis. It's a synthesis. It's not. It's because that's what you get when you put two theses together.
No, I agree. I mean, the creedal principles are necessary, but not sufficient. I think even if you look at the Declaration of Independence, I'm at Civitas Institute. We're about to publish a book of 25 essays on the Declaration from various scholars, and I wrote the introduction. One of the things I say in the introduction is, I think the Declaration itself, when you step back and you read the entire document, and you don't just take the second paragraph, but then you ask yourself, what are the grievances about? And what kind of a society cared about those grievances? Where did they get that from? The English common law, the English constitutional tradition, and foments a rebellion on the basis of those being violated, and then writes those into the Constitution itself. This is a political culture already that had congealed around really strong, not only principles, but principles that could be acted upon in law, etched into law, and then would shape behavior, thinking, and how people understood themselves and how they understood themselves as self-governing people. And so I think even in the Declaration, you have an unwritten constitution emerging that can meld with sort of these strong natural right principles and gives you sort of America, which is a synthesis. I think another neglected figure, Orestes Bronze in the 19th century, makes a very similar argument about the unwritten constitution being necessary to help us make sense of our written constitution. And that's where he says it's rooted in the common law. It's rooted in biblical religion. It's rooted in the fact that we have these states that are separate from one another, and you had to make sense of in some way with a federalist or decentralized constitution. These immigration patterns that he says are largely democratic in the sense of they come here and are content to be equal with each other, although maybe not necessarily congealing and getting along in all respects, and plus a highly commercial culture. That's sort of a way of thinking about an unwritten foundation that our Constitution can plan itself on. So I agree with you completely. But my sense is, if you even think about J.D. Vance's, he won the Statesmanship Award that the Claremont Institute gave out, I think it was last summer in 2025, and he sort of deprecates the idea of a propositional nation. But he does so by using the progressive, unlimited, emancipated, individualistic definition of that proposition, and then says, but there are people here whose roots in this country go back generations who neglect that. And if we accept the propositional nation definition, we would have to say they can no longer stay here and be Americans. And then we would also have to accept people from abroad in an unlimited capacity. Neither of those ideas are true. He hasn't even accurately stated the principles, but yet he uses it to deprecate it. And so when you do that, when you make that move, though, inevitably, what's the new foundation of America? And my sense is it's something. Maybe it's white culture. It's capital T traditionalism, something like that. And I think that's kind of, you saw this also in Eric Schmitt's, the senator from Missouri, his speech at the National Conservatism Convention last summer in 2025. Everything was about, he starts with the immigrants or the pioneers in the 19th century. That's sort of the way to think about America. But it doesn't really ask any other foundational questions about America itself, which also suggested to me trying to provide a new foundation, or build on something that paleoconservatives, I think, have long said about the American founding. And I don't think it's true overall. It doesn't do justice to the synthesis, but it also suggests you're building such a particularistic definition of citizenship. It's not going to make sense to Americans outside of that circle, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. I mean, the Heritage American thing, which Vance has embraced, right?
Is that the foundation? Yeah.
Yeah, which is, sort of white America plus, right? Or white culture plus. I still laugh every time I look up the thing about how he said, if your ancestors fought in the Civil War, I think you should have more say about the direction of this country than someone who just got here. And like, that's such an un-American and illiberal idea, but it could be salvaged a little bit. Like, I would still disagree with it if he'd said, if your ancestors fought to save the Union on the Union side.
Yeah.
But like he's like, if you were a Confederate, if your ancestor was a
Yeah.
Confederate general, you should have more say. I was like, really?
Yeah.
But I I I think. So let me ask you this, because I mean I can get crazy bogged down in this stuff. I kind of obsess about it. But getting back to the Declaration, since you just worked on it, this book, and if you have a link for it, we'll put it in the show notes.
Okay.
Where do you come down on the Jaffa Wills, Gary Wills? The idea that you know, I think it's Gordon Wood who says that the important thing about the Declaration at the time of its signing was the conclusion. We're breaking, America is breaking away. And it wasn't until later, basically with Lincoln, where the argument is that Lincoln is the guy. I'm dumbing this way down, but like Lincoln's the guy who noticed the beginning of the Declaration and said, "Hey, you know what? Those are the liner notes, right? That is the actual mission statement for the Constitution and for what we're doing here." And that principle of equality gets elevated. I have my own sympathies, but I'm just kind of curious, how you see it.
So I think, another figure that looms in the 19th century, who is now a great biography that's just been published on him, is Charles Sumner.
Mm-hmm.
And, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, and is very much a part of, so it isn't just Lincoln. It's also, William Seward, others who are building principles of American constitutionalism and political thought on the Declaration at the time. And I think it clearly was playing a role in the mind of John Calhoun, who is sort of the dean of Southern pro-slavery, pro-secessionist political thought. I mean, John Calhoun's writings are fascinating. If you go back and look through the way he dealt with the tariffs and the way he is trying to redesign American constitutionalism to protect the South, he clearly understands that there is something foundational about America that he is at war with, and then comes out and says it, right? The Declaration was a lie. And clearly the Confederate statesmen, Jefferson Davis and also Alexander Stephens, take issue with the Declaration and sort of the founding addresses of the Confederacy. So I'm not sure that's the case, but that it sort of languishes. I think, just to reference again, Orestes Bronson, when he was in his radical left-wing phase in the 1820s and 1830s, is giving July 4th addresses, appealing to the equality of the Declaration in a very French Revolution kind of an argument. So it's clearly circulating. And my sense is, though, when you're in a conflict, people start looking for principles to define themselves, to understand what they're doing, and to motivate people and to argue for the truth of their position. And so the Declaration returns in a very powerful way as we progress into the 1850s and 1860s. And the South has made it very clear it's not going to reconcile. It's not going to compromise on this position. So my sense would be it's largely, I'm not too worried if the Declaration had been dormant. I mean, I don't think it was dormant, but it's something that and it is also the case, Lincoln's statesmanship with the Declaration does change the face of the country. It changed the direction of American constitutionalism, American politics. Not in the criticism that he moves us by making equality central, he then puts us in a progressive frame of mind, I don't think is true either. But that's all in my mind for the good of what Lincoln is doing there. We forget to, people, self-governing people get lazy, forget their principles, settle into conformity, settle into habit and inertia. And sort of, you need a statesman from time to time. You need someone to shock you back into who you are, to remind you who you are. So that's how I see Lincoln. We think about the electric court speech as well. I mean, that may be Lincoln's best reply to a lot of these controversies we're dealing with now, and that he's talking about the immigrants to America who have come and can't lay claim to any family connection to the founding. But he says they are one of us, and they're one of us. Why? Because of these founding principles. So that would be sort of my response to your question.
Yeah, I mean, just picking off of that, that's part of my problem with that Senator Schmidt speech, which I'm sure was written by this guy Nate Hochman.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
It is particularly his ancestors, or the generations of ancestors that he had, the sort of 1830s, 1840s, early 1850s Germans who came to Missouri. A lot of them were what were called 48ers.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were people fighting for liberal Republican government in Germany, and they lost the fight. A bunch of them were executed. A lot of them were thrown in jail. Some went into self-imposed exile. A lot of them came to the United States, and those people who were fighting for, at least male suffrage, for constitutional rights of some kind, for free speech, they were considered radicals in Europe. There were radicals in Europe, and then they come to America, and they like the Chartists who came here, they call themselves conservatives because what they were fighting for over there was a birthright over here. And you can look at if you look at the numbers of how many 48ers joined the Union Army, 12 years later, 10 to 15 years later, it is staggering. I mean, like, whole regiments were made up of these guys who felt an obligation to fight for the thing that they had been fighting for over there. And they believed this was a creedal nation. They didn't come to America purely to like carve something out of the wilderness. They came to America because they were escaping tyranny in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually that's funny. My own family story. Two brothers with my last name come to America and settle in Nebraska in the 1850s for this reason, according to family genealogy. So it's interesting you bring that up. No, I thought the Schmidt thing as well. It seemed to me it was suggestive of where he's drawing the line as to what constitutes American citizenship in a particular moment, particular time, and not then bringing that line forward and asking himself, all of the people who came to America in the 20th century and in the 21st century, just sort of, and it seemed to me, it was like, can I find a foundation somewhere in a way that supports my understanding of America, or in the sense of pioneers. But then even if you want to take the pioneers, what type of a country produces those types of pioneers? What sort of principles, what sort of thinking, what sort of motions and culture sets them in motion? And does that just sort of end? Or do you think that has any appeal now and applies to immigrants who have come recently? It seems to me as well, it's kind of a fascinating thing. The emerging Democratic majority thesis was clearly proven wrong. It seemed to me it gave rise to a lot of progressive hubris, particularly in the Obama administration. They couldn't lose anymore as the country was, less white, less religious, and that has proven not to be the case. And so it also adds to confusion in my mind as why you would want to build on that sort of a thesis. You're thinking about states like Florida and Texas as well, which have arguably become more Republican in recent years, even though they have become more racially diverse. And it's just sort of, raises these questions of something about America itself changing people and changing subsequent generations of people who have come to this country in a different direction than maybe they were anticipating. And so that's all, in my mind, a way of saying, don't lose your faith. And as Calvin Coolidge said, have faith in Massachusetts, by which he meant have faith in sort of the original Puritan stock and those ideas that they had. Don't lose hope in America as well, and think you need some sort of substitute category.
Yeah, I mean, I think back on, I remember Ramesh Ponnuru I was talking to him about Indian Americans, and I've always been kind of like high on Indian Americans. I think they come as close to being the new Jews as anybody. You know, they bury their kids in guilt, overeducate them,
Yeah.
And they all want them to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. Um, and I was asking Ramesh about, who comes from a massive family of doctors. Like at his wedding, I joked, I was looking at the playbill or the program, and I was like, gosh, I hope there's not a car accident in Kansas tonight, because every doctor in Kansas is here. But I was asking him about the Christian thing, because I would do a lot back when I was in good odor on broader parts of the right. You know, I did a lot of speaking to conservative groups, and I was sort of a dinner speaker, tell funny jokes, have a point. And I always thought it was sort of, you know, I have liberal secular friends who think that the left is, that think that the right was anti-Semitic, you know, 20 years ago, right? And I was like, well, look, I think it's culturally a little weird that someone at the beginning of the dinner says, let us bow our heads. Thank you, Lord Jesus Christ, for bringing our speaker, Jonah Goldberg, here. Like, I think there's an interesting kind of tension in that, but it's clearly not anti-Semitic, right? I mean, like if they really didn't like the Jews, they wouldn't bring me in, and they would, you know, like, that's just not what's going on there. There's just sort of a cultural frequency mismatch. And Ramesh made the point that, say you're a small businessman, Indian immigrant, you own some motels or dry cleaners or whatever, and you're interested in tax stuff and property rights stuff and business regulation. And you say, you know, I'm going to go check out the Republican Party meeting for my county. And everyone at the beginning of the meeting joins hands and does a Christian prayer. Now, as an American, I got zero problem with that. Like, that's fine, you know, for an institution to want to do that kind of thing. But as a political project, you have to ask yourself, am I going to make this club more attractive? Am I more likely to make this Indian American guy say, this isn't the club for me, right? I mean, they can all be polite, but there's just something as a Hindu that's just going to create a barrier to entry if that's what you're telegraphing up front. If you're telegraphing up front that the Republican Party is the party of preserving white culture, you're turning people away at the door that are gettable in ways that I just think is just so colossally stupid. I should say, as a matter of professional courtesy, my colleague Roy Teixeira, who co-wrote the Emerging Democratic Majority Thesis, he will make a very persuasive case that you're right in how how Democrats read that book.
That's not how it meant. Yeah.
But he was very clear in the book, if the Democrats hold on to the white working class, and the way
that's who they hated. That's who they
right. But a bunch of barista socialists said, aha, we don't need the white working class, and push them out of the coalition rather than holding on to them. You're not a Democratic majority. You cannot be a majority party without a significant chunk of the white working class in this country, because that's the majority demographic in America.
Yeah. It seems to me as well. I mean, I wrote about this after the 2020 election, where, you know, thinking, because the 2020 election was kind of mixed in the sense of Trump lost, he did lose, but the Republicans did, you know, well in Congress, well in Senate. They did well in a lot of state legislative, gubernatorial elections. And it sparked to my mind, you know, Montesquieu made a great argument one time. In modern republics that are built on a social contract basis of liberty are going to have a very fluid set of politics, precisely because people are going to value individual and economic personal liberty so much, such that as a political coalition comes into power and starts to take itself too seriously, starts to listen to its most extreme voices, doesn't moderate, necessarily those on the margins of that coalition will feel themselves under threat, will see themselves as maybe being consumed by the coalition they're a part of, and they'll peel off and they'll join the opposition. And that sort of creates this endless churn dynamic. And it seems to me and then if you add to that our politics is so set by executive power, determined by executive power, which the nature of executive power is cutting and splitting and alienating, unless it's done on behalf of a legislated consensus that can lay claim to, you know, representing in some sense the country. But our executive power decides crucial issues on its own enforces them, and then sets back and judges them. And so inevitably, essentially the Montesquieu thesis is on steroids, the way to think about our politics. And when, if Ross Douthat says already, Trump has lost the country, let's say he's right. Clearly something has happened already in the first year that he has lost a lot of steam. To me, it's the same reason Biden did. It's the same reason Obama never achieved the third New Deal. It's you're laying down harsh measures, and people in your coalition peel off. And Trump, the coalition that has peeled off, was the really exciting part in my mind, which were Latino immigrants or second, third generation immigrants who are now voting Republican. And they now, right? I think anecdotally, what you hear is, I mean, there was a surgeon in Dallas who said that her mother walked out of a mall in suburban Dallas and was detained by ICE agents. It was only set free because she could pull up her passport on her phone. Those stories reverberate through those communities.
For sure.
Inevitably, you're losing people, and that's kind of what's happened.
I've made this point a million times on here, but I just think it's fascinating. At the beginning of the Trump administration, Modelo was the #1 beer in America. And it has dropped precipitously because Mexican American or Hispanic Americans aren't having parties. They're not having large social gatherings for fear of. It's part of the explanation. It's not the only one, but it's a pretty plausible one. I've talked to people in the industry or adjacent to the industry about it, some consultants. And like, you may be a full-fledged American citizen, but you have a big, sort of cliched, big, sprawling family, everyone getting together in the parking lot at, the church social or whatever. And you're, dorking around with cars and tailgating and all that kind of stuff. And that's a target for ICE. Yeah. And somebody in that group might not be an American citizen. And a lot of people might be mistaken for non-citizens. And so people are just sheltering in place. And I think about, David French once gave a really moving explanation about how he changed his views on racism in America when he adopted a daughter from Ethiopia. And he said, the way to think about it is, let's say that, just to pick a number, 1% of your interactions with people are racist. That means that 99% of the interactions are not racist and blah, 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 blah. But like, you have 500, 1,000 interactions in a given week. That means you have 2, 3, 4, 5 racist interactions where someone says something about your child, right? And think about sort of like my point earlier about like the tariff stuff. And if they came up with a stupid kind of traffic ticket, like, all you need is a few of those experiences and they loom extremely large. Every interpersonal anti-Semitic experience I've ever had in my life, and there have been very, very few, they loom large because they make you mad. You remember them. If you're getting pulled over and cuffed by ICE and you're an American citizen, you're going to be so friggin' pissed off. Mm-hmm. And rightly so, and I think that stuff really reverberates. But Trump assumed that if you pulled a lever for MAGA, for Trump, that you were 100% bought into MAGA. And that was really, really dumb.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, and I come back to, so we still have, in many respects, a revolutionary left. I think in this country, as much as I might criticize certain parts of the Trump administration, you have a left that's incredibly problematic. And, but now you have, I think, opened the door in many respects to this coming back in the next midterm, which is not unique to Trump. I mean, this has happened to most presidents in dramatic swings. So that's unfortunate. But it's also the case that the parts of the Trump administration that have worked, that could work, that if they're allowed to keep going, aren't really being emphasized enough and aren't really being built on enough. And I think it's maybe because they're uncomfortable with it. I don't know. But those are all the sorts of things that you should be emphasizing. And that's fallen by the wayside, I think, as we move into what I think will be not only the, losing of a majority, endless investigations into the Trump administration, but I think now the inevitable question of what's next for not just the Republican Party, but for the conservative movement. Because I think Trump being the center of our politics for a decade, when the end of his power becomes very clear to everyone, and I think it could come very quickly this fall, the jostling is going to be immense for the future. And what I hope is these principles that I've tried to write about in the commentary essay, I hope these principles can reemerge in the forefront of what we were all about to begin with, which we forget. After the 2014 election, Charles Cook and NRO has made this point. Republican elected office holders were like the highest number in history. Like the Republican Party was doing very well at holding power. The one question mark was the presidency. And somehow the idea of holding that led us into this new terrain. And so the question could be, but nothing is determined. The future is not determined. It can be renegotiated, rethought, and a new round of deliberation of what we're going to be.
So let me last question. Okay. I struggle with this. I make this point all the time that I think that one of the problems of the conservative movement, and I will fully admit there's a certain amount of self-serving, self-justification involved in this psychologically for me, as I've disengaged in certain respects. But I think that one of the problems the conservative movement got itself into was thinking that conservative intellectuals, conservative journalists, conservative pundits, that kind of thing, that they were in some ways de facto political consultants for the Republican Party.
Yeah.
The blood-brain barrier between the two had been really, really broken down to the point where, even very good friends of mine who are conservative intellectuals, conservative journalists, they'll break down into talking about how I think we'll do really well in November, that kind of thing, right? And there are a bunch of them who think their job is to come up with the best framing for how Republicans can sell their policies. And I say this as someone who was sort of part of that project to some extent for a very, very long time. It is not how the conservative movement was born, right? There used to be a much healthier tension between, certainly National Review and Eisenhower and Nixon, right?
Yeah.
And listening to your last, comments, I want to be really clear. Some of the people I respect and admire the most out there are guilty of what I am talking about. And that doesn't mean I reject their analysis or their friendship.
Yeah.
But it's something that I increasingly have lost my taste for the partisan part of the conservative movement.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think you and I are aligned on the thing that says, I would like our people who think like us, broadly speaking, to reassert themselves intellectually on the right and in politics, right? I would like to see a restorationist sort of Reaganite movement in the post-Trump era. But I just don't know that I can ever go back to raising my big foam finger and cheering, one team, because I have such contempt for so many people in the Republican Party. Doesn't mean I have a lot of respect for people in the Democratic Party. I feel like, I don't know, Peter Verreck, right? I just feel on the outside or Murray Rothbard. We're like, to hell with all of these people. And I'm just wondering, how do you wrestle with that tension?
So I think, I have also, I left the Heritage Foundation in the fall of 2023 because I understood exactly where that place was going under just the interactions I was having up and down the chain at the Heritage Foundation. So certainly the decisions that I made have earned me no new friends. I mean, Father Newhouse told someone who joined the board of directors at First Things one time, you'll have all the wrong enemies and none of the right friends. I think I have a lot of good friends. So I won't say that's exactly true, but certainly I understand the tension and the points that you raised. I guess what I have always tried to do is to be very grateful for the opportunity that I've had to read a lot of books and have conversations with a lot of people who are much smarter than me and much more learned in everything. And I've always tried to take that and use it in my mind, and maybe I'm self-serving, use it in the best way I can with the platforms and the opportunities that I have to sort of put those ideas forward. And I think uniquely, my career, Liberty Fund, I'm working with a lot of libertarians. I'm a conservative. I work with a lot of conservatives too. I've worked with a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different kinds of experiences. And so I think I've always thought in a way, it's like Can you put, American conservatism as a synthesis? It's a union of opposites in many respects. Can you put that together and try and remind people what this was all about, you know, in a future iteration of conservatism? Because the future changes. Things will be different in the future by definition. There will be new opportunities. Things that once seemed inevitable will no longer happen. That's the nature of politics, particularly in America. And so I think things will, there will be a new platform, a new opportunity to present ideas. So that's what, I'm trying to do. And I think we're trying to do at Civitas Outlook and in the Civitas Institute at UT Austin, is put forward that best case scenario. I have no idea if, I have no idea if people in power are actually going to glom onto that, but I think we have to try.
All right. I could start a whole another hour right from there. But I got to get going, and so do you.
I'm under no illusions, I should say. Yeah.
Well, William Rusher always used to say you always used to tell new hires at NR, politicians will always disappoint you.
Yeah.
And the point was not like because politicians are inherently bad people. The point is that politicians respond to different incentives than idealistic, hardcore ideological dorks who want to work for little magazines or obscure think tanks. Yeah. And that's true, right? But the level of disappointment has been really remarkable.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah. All right, my friend. Thanks so much, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right.
All right, so Richard Reinsch has left the studio. I know this was kind of like a greatest hits thing for some of the themes we've talked about a bunch on here, but I just wanted to check in with him. I kind of feel like I should be lending aid and comfort who are going to be part of any effort to have a restoration of American conservatism in the post-Trump era. Whether that's entirely possible or not, I think you can have partial success, and that's still better than not trying at all. So we'll see what happens. Many thoughts about all of this. I will probably on the solo be talking more about white culture. I did a long G file about it that didn't quite scratch the itch, as you can tell. And in fact, by the time you listen to this, the solo will have already come out. So if I repeat myself there, you get what you pay for. And speaking of paying for things, you should subscribe to the Dispatch. It's you'd be helping us, helping yourself, and you'd be doing a mitzvah, as my people might say. And with that, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.